Oh, you have yours.
Is it okay? You can connect to your laptop?
Seems so. This is coming from my laptop.
That's okay.
And yes,
Perfect. Okay, we'll bring everyone.
and the only thing is the voice. I didn't check.
You have to turn it on.
Wait a minute. Maybe I need to switch it on.
Yeah.
Hello. Very good. Perfect. Thank you very much. And the only thing is that this one will not work.
Oh, sorry.
Okay, Heiner, you have to share magic with these people. Some of them need to hear what we're doing.
What?
You need to share the magic.
The magic?
The magic.
It's all hard work.
I know.
Okay, I
Hello, everybody. Are we all here? We can start. Did you have your coffee? Excellent. Okay, so we have the concluding session of today. Have two keynote speech. We have now the first keynote speech from Heiner Oberkampf. He's the co-founder of Accurate and also an external advisory board member of OntoCommons. So the stage is to Heiner.
Thank you very much, Akko, for the invitation and for giving the opportunity to talk here about the Idmp Oncology project. This is work that we started quite some time ago and which gets really active in the recent months. So I'll give you a quick intro about the project and the ISO standard that's related to that, describe the ontology, how we approach the modeling, and some examples also for patterns. And then how we use the ontology, we'll give some examples from Bayer and Novartis who implement the ontology internally, and then we leave enough time also for questions. So Idmp, as Lisa said, is 5 standards. So it's about medicinal product, so the package, the pharmaceutical product, what you swallow or what you inject somehow into your body, then everything around substances and the chemistry related to those, and things like dosage forms, usage of measure, etc. And this is driven by regulatory requirements. From next year on, the EMA, so European Medicines Agency, will subsequently enforce this standard for all drug submissions. So any pharma company that wants to bring some new drug on the market needs to provide the data in that standard. And also the FDA is implementing that standard already. And this gives sufficient pressure for companies to implement that. But in these implementations, and before starting Accurate as a software company, I worked a lot as a consultant. I saw at Novartis, at Bayer, looking at the FDA data, that all of these organizations implement that PDF standard, this ISO standard, in different ways. And this basically leads to the high risk that there are inconsistencies in interpretation of the data, etc. And there's a lot of use cases related to patient safety. For example, one company detects that a certain substance is toxic, and they report this to the authorities, and then other pharma companies could check whether they use this certain chemical. But today, they're basically not able to identify all the products internally just for one company that contains a certain substance. Very basic questions, very difficult to answer in today's landscape. So what we do with the ontology is we augment the ISO standard. There's already an ISO standard working group ongoing on the logical model. Sheila Els from Bayer is leading that working group, and with her, I initiated this Idmp ontology project. So initially, we started this with Bayer, then Roche, Novartis, and Merck GSK joined quite early. This is about 1.5 years ago. And then we took a long time to find the right use cases and actually define what an ontology MVP could look like. So this took about a year. And now, since half a year, we are running the MVP phase that has the goal to produce an MVP ontology that is usable, implementable at pharma companies. And this project runs from April this year to September, so we're close to releasing the ontology and going over to the next phases. So the implementation is, on the one hand, the governance framework from the Idmp Council, so that we can collaboratively work on these ontologies. Ostus, my previous employer, is doing the ontology development together with Elisa. And Accurate is used for the use case implementation, which I also show a little bit later. And what was clear from the beginning is that we need to align all these efforts with other interested stakeholders, so like the FDA or the EMA, or standardization bodies, etc. The project itself is purely financed by the pharma companies, so by these now, I think, 7, soon 9 companies to support this. And what we also quite early recognized, for the long-term funding of this project, we need senior stakeholder commitment. So from all sponsoring pharma companies, we now have people who have budget authority. So a head of regulatory affairs and operations, for example, in Bayer, is in our executive advisory board. And this ensures that we have a long-term funding strategy, or have these people who make money decisions involved. Now, the initial goal was to connect the industry, mostly from the regulatory perspective, but there are a lot of different other players. What we now see is that this is the very big vision, but the immediate vision is to use this standard to align the different functions within a pharma company. So research with clinical, chemical development, with regulatory, with manufacturing, etc. And to allow all these different functions to remain a little bit in their silo thinking, because they need to run efficiently their business processes, while they all hook in to the ontology, where we need to have an accurate representation of what things are so that we can answer competency questions that go across functions effectively. And so the initial attempt was actually something, this question here that the EMA asked Bayer. So basically they ask, which clinical studies do you have right now with products and certain active ingredients where you administer to patients? And the expectation is that you can answer these questions on the phone. The reality is that after a week of combining Excel exports from different sources, Bayer sent the wrong list to the EMA. And then afterwards did a data integration project that took 3 months, and now they can answer this question. But we want to answer questions more effectively. Now, what we did is we broke down this question into all kinds of different questions that are going across the value chain. So, for example, just the active moiety relationship about the substance and the substance that is doing the trick, so the active ingredient in the chemical. Or other things like what's the certain codes for substances, or investigational products that are used in clinical trials, etc. And these questions basically help us to define also the scope of the ontology. And now the ISO standards, as I said, are 5 standards, and we said we start with substance and structure information because this spans across the whole value chain, and it makes sense to start with that one. So basically going from inside of the product to more to the packaging. And how we do that is, and I think this is repeatedly said in this workshop also, we take use cases, create competency questions that are concrete, and then the ISO standards are basically our guiding authority, and this together forms the scope of what we model, and then, very important, we test this with real data. And real data is data from FDA that is public, or internal data at Bayer, Merck, Novartis, GSK, etc. Yeah? And because we can't do the whole Idmp ISO standard in an MVP. So basically we have here a class hierarchy, the ontology, and then the data graph. And while the ontology is maybe a few hundred concepts, the data graph are many millions elements. So just at one pharma company, you have maybe 7,000 products at Bayer. And substance is a lot more. Now in the ISO standards, we have some nice diagrams like this, where the most important concepts are displayed with descriptions, and the initial attempt was just to take the ISO standard and triplify that without a lot of reasoning. So I just gave some students at Accredits the task, can just write down the ISO standards, triplify this, everything in SCOS. So we converted the PDF into a digital one, but basically without reflection, without thinking. And this is clearly not enough, and that's why we started this ontology project, where we take a more deeper look into the semantics of what these concepts mean, and also involved a lot more the SMEs from the different pharma companies, who are, by the way, also people who wrote the ISO Idmp standards. So we have the right people from GSK, from Novartis, etc. in this project. We reuse as a basis all kinds of ISO standards. We are living here in an ISO world, in this ISO Idmp context. That's why we also reused existing ISO standards that Elisa had developed in the past already. The commons ontologies provide some patterns for identifiers and names that were very useful. And this really helped us to jumpstart with the ontology development. And then things like persistent identifier policies are things that we did at the beginning. So for the ontology, one is that we host things at, or say the authority is Pistorial Alliance here. In this case, for the ontology, it is hosted by EDM Council, but I'll show this in a second. So these are the list of commons ontologies that we use. I don't go into details here. Just as an example, identifiers are not just simple attributes or simple values. Identifiers are a very key concept in integrating data from multiple sources, and they need to be contextualized. So you have a registry, for example, or registration authority. and then different identifiers are minted basically in that. And the same applies to the names. So for example, EMA may have multiple registries for different types of materials and substances. Now comes the interesting topics. So active moiety is basically the relationship between one substance and then a part of that substance that is doing is responsible for the biological effect. That's what we initially thought is the thing. And so for each substance, we say, okay, this is the active one. And the simplest way would be to make this a direct relationship. Amlodipine benzoate has an active moiety amlodipine. But then you start the discussion with the SMEs, and then you have people who are biologists or in the vaccines business say, in our case, with our substance, it's a little bit different. There are a lot of different things that can have biological effect. Why is not this small thing maybe also having a biological effect? Maybe not the most important, so maybe it's not regulatory relevant, but it has an effect. So he doesn't want to call this active moiety. And so what we did here is basically, in this case, we couldn't directly take the ISO definition and make this a simple relationship, but we needed to contextualize this and just over here. So this relationship basically we modeled as a role, also a typical ontological concept, but we contextualize this so that we can say this is an active moiety relationship from regulatory perspective or from scientific perspective, or has a certain jurisdictional context, so that it applies only to the US or only to Europe. And we can subclass on the one hand the different roles, but also the context. So if we want to further make subcontext where certain relationships are valid, then we can do this with this approach here. So this gives a lot of flexibility that we think this pattern is simple and stable enough that we can apply this to all kinds of different situations, and that this is can be kept stable. Yeah, and there is a case in the FDA data, for example, where aripiprazole Lorexil has two active moieties. One is the one who's actually doing the trick, and the other one was just indicated as the active for patent purposes. So two different contexts where you have the active and there's not one active ingredient. So this we also modeled where then one has the regulatory context, the other one has more the patent exclusivity context, which applies only to the US. Another example, the basis of strength. So when you take some medication and you buy that in Sweden versus UK versus Netherlands, the same product will have different labels on the outside with different levels or different descriptions of the strength. And this is because this comes off from country-specific regulatory cases. And in fact, this is all the same product, but it looks like very different dosage forms and basis of strength. And there's a lot of potential risk for patients taking or getting wrong medications because the basis of strength is not entirely clear. And it is a complicated thing because sometimes the basis of strength is relative to the active ingredient. So how much of the thing that is really doing it and how much of the bigger substance is actually applied. And with Idmp, we have a normalized representation so that we can actually compare different styles of the dosage. And again, here we apply the role pattern where substance plays an ingredient role in the context of a product, and then this is used for the strength definition. Another one in clinical trials, so imagine you have a medication that is already approved for a certain indication. So you give aspirin for headache, but maybe there's other indications that you can take aspirin for, but you need to prove in a clinical trial that this product is actually efficient for that purpose. So for this, also products play different roles as an investigational, so still under in a clinical trial. And it can be on the same time authorized for a certain indication or for a certain jurisdiction. So it could be that, for example, it's authorized in the EU, but still not authorized in the US. Also here, the roles play an important role. Now, the implementation components that we use to demonstrate the connection between the data and the ontology. On the one hand, we have the Idmp ontology development governance environment, and this includes Git repository or also an Onto viewer and a Jira, all kinds of things, the hygiene testing, etc. This is where the ontology is built, and then with Accurates, we take that ontology plus data from FDA or other standards, public data, and with that we allow to answer the competency questions that I've shown. This here in this slide. So we have the different competency questions that we can answer all of those, and basically after we've answered those with the ontology and with data, we can say, okay, we delivered the MVP. Fast forward. And the same is done internally at the pharma companies, but of course they have different setups. Some have Accurate, some use their own technology stack. And just to give you two examples for that, one is, and we actually made this a little game, so that we compared per competency questions. We have different implementation steps. So some people struggle even with identifying the SMEs in their environment, in their large company. But in the meantime, they have found all the relevant people. Mapping the terminologies, identification of where's the data to answer the question. Then the ontology needs to be ready to map the data. Then somebody needs to specify how the mapping is, so which types internally align to which types in the Idmp ontology, etc. And then one can implement that and answer questions. And as you see here, Bayer, who also initiated this on work, GSK, Novartis, these are also the companies who are first in implementing that. But it's also good to see that others who are typically a little bit laggards, like Boehringer or J&J, are also already using this. Now, just give an example of Bayer. Bayer had already for 5 years established let's say called a semantic ecosystem. So this is a knowledge graph around substances, but they had their own substance ontology. So what we did is we took the Bayer compound ontology and aligned that with the Idmp ontology on certain concepts that are relevant for the competency questions. And then mapped the different patterns, etc. And then showed that certain things, so for here's an example, hydrocortisone, we aligned that to the Idmp concepts, and we did the overlay with the GSRS data, so the data from the FDA, the Global Substance Registration Service. And with that, we can answer, for example, this question of which substances are the active moiety of another one. The overlay I showed in the Novartis case. In the Novartis case, the main thing was that the data relevant for these competency questions is managed in a product lifecycle management system where everything is process oriented. So everything is captured as a change request and variants of the substances, etc. So basically, they have all the data to connect the substance with the product, but they don't get it out. And it seems to be that complicated that the process is dictating the data structures to such an extent that they cannot answer the question for a certain substance, which products are affected. Very simple thing. Or the active moiety is not there at all. So what we did here again, map the internal representation. So for example, so we mapped these different concepts from Novartis again to the Idmp ontology, and as you see also, in some cases, this is there's not an equivalence relationship. So there need to be case-by-case decisions on where to map what. And again, here, reusing the patterns for contextualized names, for contextualized identifiers. And what we'd also do then in Accurates is make mapping proposals. So we can basically take the Novartis data and based on the attributes on, for example, the chemical formula, etc., we can identify matches. So we can overlay that with public data, in this case from the FDA. And we get a lot of additional names, additional identifiers that in the end help to in data integration pipelines, for example, when you connect data from multiple systems. So this is the one thing. And the other thing here is the substance relationship, so that you basically have a relationship from ketoprofen fumarate to the active ingredient ketoprofen. And another thing is that the hierarchy allows now to very simply connect or see which substances are in which products. Very simple questions, but this already showed very big value for Novartis, because before that they were not able to answer a certain question. Now they are able to. And there's no big ontology in principle behind that so far, but first it comes showing value and then comes showing something fancy. So what we did in the 6 months is we have an Idmp ontology MVP, which we say is quality assured that they can use it in production, and which is aligned with different experts. And also with the governance is very important, because sometimes you have very strong personalities from the SME side to say it needs to be modeled like this, or this is wrong, or that, and you really need to have a process where you can make decisions. The active Moiety was really an example where we needed to make a steering committee decision that we are allowed to call this way and move on, because these topics were discussed for 20 years almost in the ISO world, and it's still not implemented. What we in this project really achieved is that in 6 months we solved some of these, or just decided certain things together as a pharma consortium, and even then people from the FDA say, finally somebody just says we do it like that. Then we demonstrate the use with public data and internal data. We now have also AstraZeneca and Amgen soon joining, so then we're 9 companies, and this will become a technical specification. At least we submitted this now for standardization by ISO, so that they can have a technical specification that refers to the ontology as the implementation out of it. Don't go into the next phases. What is interesting is that when we look now into the next phase, that we want to connect the regulatory, which is the initial driver of the Idmp, with the manufacturing world, because a lot of use cases, and this is basically at all pharma companies, they say there's a high value in this because the perspectives are so different. Regulatory comes from the package and goes deeper into the product. Manufacturing, very process oriented and takes raw materials, then converts this into another raw materials, does something with that. So it builds up things. And there's a lot of different stakeholders involved, the supply chain, the contract research organizations, etc. And so quite a challenge to bring these different perspectives together. And this is also not directly Idmp primary scope. So, but it is a high value use case. No? So in a modularized approach that we also took for the ISO standards, we want to capture now the manufacturing area, again, for certain use cases that are valuable for the pharma companies. And with that, I would open for questions.
Okay, any questions for Heiner? Anybody? Yes, Chris.
I have an awkward question, and I apologise in advance for this. And you have every right to do exactly the same to me. Yeah, is that you talked about a moiety, and I have a liking for etymology, and moiety apparently comes from the Latin for middle, and on the definition it talks about part. And you also talked about a role pattern. And I understand about role patterns and so forth, but if you come from my background, and I'm going to try and tar a few other people, maybe I won't name names, but other people would assume it's part, it's Mariology. And what I wonder is whether you considered it as Mariological relation, running it as Mariology, where Mariology fits into it. Because for me, at least, Mariology and naming are the two core things that a child of 5 can understand. So you should be able to fit into your ontology. I mean, am I making sense? Do you see what I'm saying?
So is it a question on the role concept, why we say a substance plays a certain role in a product context?
My understanding of the sense
Or-
of moiety is it means
Or the wording moiety?
moiety means part, doesn't it?
Yeah, it is as in this. So it is in the end a part of the whole molecule.
So do you have a generalized part relation, of which this is a subtype?
Kind of.
I'll
So-
let answer the expert here.
Yeah. So we've looked at a number of different models for Mariology. We took a very thin veneer from a couple of them and have applied those, but we did not dive any deeper because the philosophical arguments among the chemists and among the other people participating, as Heiner mentioned, go back 20 to 30 years. We did not want to rehash the 20 or 30 years worth of arguments about that. And so we said, okay, we'll just do this very thin veneer thing for now. And if, as we get deeper into the project, we need to get deeper into the semantics of that, then I know who to call when I need to get into the Mariological part of the model. But
Just, I'm intrigued. Is that when you say a thin layer, so you had a supertype that was part, or you just know it's a part?
we only include the relationships right now. So whole part relations, we have part of it and it has part, and then some proper parts.
That's
Just that.
a supertype of moiety, is that right?
Of the relationship for has active moiety,
You
yes.
distinguish between role and relation.
Yeah.
Okay, not now, but sometime, maybe over a drink, you can explain. I would be
Happy to do
intrigued.
that.
I'd be intrigued.
Happy to do that.
Yeah, and just maybe to
Yeah, exactly. Or something with more alcohol.
just to give you maybe another example is for the chemical entities, we also started a discussion. Is this Ari Propazolorix, is this a class or is it an instance? And we said we don't discuss this. We just make this like instances because everybody from the SMEs, they will understand. And as we get to manufacturing where we really need to talk about real world entities, then we may discuss this. But from regulatory purpose, everything is just information. So from the ontological point of view, we would have a very, very narrow branch somewhere and everything is information, make everything complicated at classes and etc. without having the benefit of making it very simple to answer business question. And you really see that at the pharma companies, the people who implement that, and they are already, they know OWL and they know this, but they would just say, we don't accept the increase of complexity for these questions. If they see later a case where you really need to do that as classes, like for example, in Cabby is it done, then maybe we do that. But for now, simple.
I will ask you a question. Sorry, I took the microphone and I am in the first place. Every time that we talk about some philosophical background on ontology, I have listened the same answer. No, we don't want to increase the complexity. But the point is that ontology should decrease the complexity of the models, because if you really identify the meta classes of your entity, you have a very regular model and so on. So please don't answer like this anymore, not in a formal ontology conference, because it seems to me that, okay, industrial is dealing with data, okay, solve the problem of the industry. But the interoperability and semantic problem, we need to make the meaning of the word explicit. Part of this can be a lot of different relationships. I have several papers write about this, because ontology, that's the main problem. on defining rock and the properties of the rock.
So,
Yeah, maybe to motivate.
can I answer for you? So Mara, is that if you were a complexity theorist, complexity means more functional. And what happens is that as scientific theories get more deeply simple, they get more complex. So complexity is a good thing. I'm trying to say this, we're even now, yeah?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so maybe rational or thinking is there are two aspects. Of course, the ontology should make a lot of things more simple, and it just makes things more simple because you don't have 1,000 different concepts for what is a chemical substance and a nucleic acid and all these things, but you have a few that everybody agrees on. Huge reduction in complexity. Yeah?
And there's
But
one more thing.
just the technical thing that when you move from chemicals, from instances to classes, that the relationships you all need to have with our restrictions, etc., is just a factor 4 more complicated or more triples. And yeah, you can do that. You can also deal with that. But the people at Merck, etc., they just say why. And for these questions that we had, there was no case for that. So that's just for the MVP phase. We say, let's postpone that question instance class for later.
The other part of that question is that we will get a lot more complicated in terms of adding some of those layers that you're talking about. But what we've agreed to so far is to do that through mapping initially, so that we can really see where the information flows and we can get a better sense of what needs to be on the ontology for this application versus what does not. So this doesn't mean that I don't want your model of Mariology, because I'm longtime friends with Nicola and I know that his model of Mariology is excellent. So that's not the question. The question is, when do we need it? And then what do we map to?
That's a much better answer than the previous one.
That's why we travel together.
I'm the ontologist and we're together, exactly.
I cannot avoid us complaining about this. Don't say that we are avoiding complexity. No, say that we don't need this detail on that time of the industrial project. That's a good answer.
Yeah, agree.
And you know the answer.
Okay, so we have one question from the remote participant. Ivan Wallace asks, mapping seemed to be a formal part of the process and a digital output. What form do the mapping specs take?
Yeah, so in the cases now with Bayer, Novartis, Merck, we implemented the mappings all with Sparkle Generate. So either from relational to RDF or from, what was the other, RDF to RDF, or from, this were the sources. So encoded in this, we could make this maybe more, also specify this in a descriptive way. Right now it's coded.
Excellent. And then another question or comment, maybe from Emanuele Ghedini, is that quantum mechanics did not make things easier and increase complexity in physics. It is ugly also according to their creators, but it made possible to explain and predict things that were not possible to explain before. Any comments?
I think we'll get there.
Yeah.
Trust me, I think we'll get there. We just aren't there yet.
All right, so one more question maybe, and then we have to really move to the next day. Okay, here is one from Emilio.
Yes, thank you. It's more a general comment on the line of Chris and Mara, in the sense that I think that, in our community, we are scientists, right? And we have also, let's say, pedagogical responsibility with respect to others, right? So, data structures are complex in themselves, right? So I think that we should educate people in industry and academia in thinking about these things seriously. Nicola Guarino used to say, he says, why ontology engineering should be easier than other engineering disciplines, right? When we build bridges, buildings, we send rockets to space. This is not easy at all, right? So we should also try to think maybe in engineering terms.
Okay, all right. I think this type of philosophical discussion should continue, and we have time.
in this evening. Yes,
I will help Heiner a little bit. I think it's not just a matter of simple and complex. There's also cost associated with the implementation.
Money in the end.
Yeah, it's money at the end. A lot of time I try to do a more complicated models, more precise model, but got pushback from the development because they don't want to build like 10 interfaces. They want just like a couple of them.
Yeah.
So
instance class relationships, do we have 20 days time for that? Yes or no? No.
Yeah.
Next.
So, yeah, but so there are multiple parties to convince. Yeah.
Nothing wrong with this approach.
Yeah.
The problem is, how do you sell your work?
Yeah, and that's an interesting discussion with self-test. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Heiner.
Thank you.
So our next keynote speaker is Chris Patridge. Yes, and Chris is the